Hi, and welcome to another installment of the George Consortium COVID-19 Law and Policy Briefing, presented by the Public Health Law Watch at Northeastern University and the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple. We're here to provide legal analysis during the COVID-19 pandemic and to answer key questions about the role of law in addressing the pandemic going forward. My name is Beletsky. I'm a professor of law and health sciences at Northeastern University, and today I'm joined by Amy Kapczynski, who is a professor of law and the faculty director of Global Health Justice Partnership at Yale Law School, as well as Gregg Gonsalves, who is the assistant professor of epidemiology at Yale and a co-director for the Global Health Justice Partnership at Yale. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to start off by kind of a broad strokes question to Amy. You've been very active at creating a sort of a novel field of legal analysis focused on law and political economy, which in many ways sort of challenges the accepted narratives about the role of markets and the role that law plays in enforcing or regulating those markets. So can you just briefly talk about that worldview, and then we'll talk about how that applies to the current pandemic?
Sure. So one way to get some insight into kind of what is going on under the rubric of law and political economy scholarship is to take a look at the blog that we, with a number of other people, produced, called the Law and Political Economy blog, super easy to find. And that was actually one of the convening points for what I think we're thinking of as a school of legal scholarship. And really the moment that a lot of this started to come together was after both, the crisis in 2008, the financial crisis, the kind of rising acute awareness of the problem of heightened inequality and also concentration of corporate power, kind of hollowing out of democracy, and then the Trump election. Kind of in the wake of all that, I started teaching a course called Law and Political Economy, and we created this blog. And the broad project, and the reason to pick the term political economy, is to rethink the relationship between politics and the economy, pushing back against some kind of conventional narratives that got deeply embedded in both legal scholarship and in policy land that we think had a lot to do with, in fact, the hollowing out of democracy, rising inequality, concentration of corporate power, and so forth. And these are really a bunch of narratives about markets, what they are, how they work, that come out of, some of you out there may be familiar with the kind of academic literature about neoliberalism. So a lot of the work that we're doing is picking up both on work on the history of capitalism and ideas about markets over time. And then particularly because a lot of what we're focused on is in the contemporary era and theories of change and how to in fact intervene in these debates, like the legitimating ideas about markets and states and even people and who we are that really organized the last couple of decades and that changed legal scholarship and a lot of policy. And those ideas many people would call neoliberal. You can also think of them as market fundamentalists. One way to think about this, these ideas go back, often ascribed back to sort of Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society, which began earlier, but they really came to the fore in the late 70s, 80s, 90s with the rise of Reagan, Thatcher, and on the global scale, the Washington Consensus, right? Ideas about markets that suggested, for example, that markets are the best we can do, that we ought to organize things through markets because markets are fair, because they're efficient, and because the state, in fact, ought to be treated with suspicion as corrupt and corruptible, as if you like, in the way this literature characterizes it, a kind of a monopolist, a bad incumbent bureaucratic kind of force. And that's the big picture of kind of some of what's going on in the neoliberal worldview. And I think a very a lot of the recent scholarship points out that these ideas were created very explicitly up against claims for redistribution and claims of sort of more democratic state making that came both in the period of anti-colonialism and in the kind of post World War II civil rights era, right? So there's a very actually interesting historical connection between those things. But for us particularly, what we're interested in is how those ideas work their way into law. So how did the law of everything from contracts to intellectual property to health law get reorganized to prioritize efficiency and to treat markets as if they had their own rules? You had to not break those rules, and that the market should really be kind of organizing society and politics kind of rather than the other way around. And so the purpose of political economy is bring politics back into our discussions of the economy. And part of what we also want to do is update the concept of political economy, which goes back to people like Smith and Marx with ideas about how structural inequality today has to be thought of not only in terms of class, but also with a lot of attention to race, gender, and other kinds of subordination that I think nowadays we should think intersectionally about. So that's the kind of big picture pitch about the idea. And it's to kind of build new conceptions about and make people aware of how law constructs markets, right? Markets are actually made of law, and law is a lot of how these ideas get embedded into our policies. And so then trying to trace, like, how is it that intellectual property law, which is what I work on often, how did the law of patents and so forth change so that it became the only obvious thing to do was to have drugs that would be so expensive that most people who needed them couldn't afford them. And that was just too bad. And there's just not very much we can do about it. Right. And similarly, in the kind of healthcare space, well, the only rational thing to do is everybody's got to have skin in the game. And so you got to build healthcare systems. Oh, I'm sorry, even for poor people, where everyone's got skin in the game, because that's the most effective way. And of course, the definitions of what's effective and efficient are organized in such a way as they're deeply biased. They're not neutral. And that's part of what we're trying to uncover, right? They get cast as neutral, but they're not. And that they're part of, in fact, the story of heightening inequality and concentration of power in the last couple of decades. And we want to build alternatives.
Right. So in many ways, it's a theoretical framework that informs the kinds of narratives that people tell about how our society is organized, right? So it in some ways pushes back against the idea of markets being sort of a central organizing framework, or the rules that those markets play by, and this myth or this conception about the invisible hand and sort of the role of these unspoken rules, natural order of things. Is
Absolutely.
that right?
Right. And we try to sort of technically show, like, it turns out money comes from the state, right? And so the central banking is a really big topic among folks because it's hugely important for thinking about financing. Like, how do we finance Medicare for all? Well, you got to know something about how money is created and so forth. But also, thinking about all kinds of narratives that get built about why the economy is more important than our lives, which is now coming back to the conversation about COVID. And in fact, the economy apparently is something that we just have to follow its rules. And whether or not we do something like replace people's income so that they can social distance, it often looks kind of out of bounds as a policy choice when we think about things in the framework of kind of a neoliberal approach.
Yeah, and so it's in many ways it's also a conversation about values because from a public health perspective we talk about sort of the health of the public being the supreme value of interest, whereas the way that our society is organized may or may not actually agree with that. We saw that play out very clearly in how people responded to policy measures to address public health versus the economy. And trying to make sense of the ordering of those values in the policy choices. Gregg, I wonder if you can sort of bring us back to earth in terms of how do you see these narratives play out in public health responses to COVID-19 or the lack thereof? You've talked and written a lot about this, and you and Amy co-authored a series in the Boston Review about these issues. So how do you see this impacting our public health response to the current pandemic?
Well, I mean, we've been talking the past few minutes about law and political economy as a theoretical framework for understanding the world, but it's had these disastrous effects on real lives. And we can, and I think what Amy and I do in the Boston Review pieces is chart sort of the, not just the neoliberal experiment effect on public health and social services and healthcare in the US, but the way capitalism is structured in the US along racial lines, which has set us up for sort of devastating health disparities that predate, the Reagan administration, predate COVID. And I think in the first piece we talk about, the aftermath of the Civil War, things like the Rural Hospitals Act in the 1940s and 50s that were designed to expand rural hospital capacity in the South, but the vote was only possible by giving Southern senators the guarantee that they could decide where those hospitals went in the future. So their governors could put them in communities that were frankly predominantly white rather than African American, and how sort of the whole sort of experiment in market-driven healthcare has really been under this idea that if we have to give healthcare to all, that means we have to give it to everybody, and that includes African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color. And so we've had sort of not just 50 years, but more than 200 years of sort of inequality in access to the franchise and in economy and all these sort of social things that many of us take for granted, and it's left us highly vulnerable to this epidemic. The reason we've had a sort of disastrous response isn't just because Donald Trump is insane, but it's because we have a fractured healthcare system which is driven by market incentives. Whether you're a rich teaching hospital or a community hospital, you're suffering under sort of this neoliberal experiment that Amy has charted out so eloquently. But the whole idea that countries around the world have been able to sustain their populaces through these terrible times because they've had a social safety net that can keep them from hitting the ground when they fall. Denmark and other countries have reimbursed salaries up to 80–90% over time. People don't have to worry about where their healthcare is coming from. Housing has been dealt with in many countries, and so we set ourselves up for a difficult path ahead, even if Trump was not in power during this worst pandemic since 1918. We were structurally vulnerable more than any other sort of industrialized country to the sort of catastrophe we see unrolling right now.
I mean, I think you can also really see the kind of hollowing out of the capacity of the state all over the response, sort of top to bottom at the local level as well as the national level, that, we're not set up to be able to respond well. And that's because of a long-standing kind of attack really on the infrastructure that we need to provide care to people. And the deliberate organization of that infrastructure in such a way that lots of people are entirely left out. Think about, the questions of, how immigrants access healthcare, people who are undocumented, think about, prisons, all of that. It's a very deliberate design to leave certain people out that puts, of course, all of us at risk, in the sense it's much harder to provide a public-oriented response when you've got these kind of structurally racist and kind of exclusionary ideas about who's entitled to resources that really govern.
Yeah, and I think it's important to take it out of the sort of the partisan lens of Democrats versus Republicans. We've had a devastating cuts to public health workforce around the country over the past 10 years, going back into the Obama administration, where they've lost 55,000 jobs across the country. There's been a 10% budget cut in CDC CDC funding over the past 10 years, and we spend 2.3 cents on the dollar on public health that we do for sort of end of life or specialty healthcare. And so this is sort of something we've accepted across the board as a society, and it's left us in great peril today.
And so how does this inform your thinking? You've proposed a number of policy ideas and kind of structural fixes. I guess, there's two levels to it. One being changing the narrative around social organization and the role of law and, what values law should uphold. And then from a technical standpoint, how do we use these ideas to paint a more functional vision of our society and sort of create the structures that we need to actually be functional?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit about the narrative. I mean, I think very fundamentally, part of what we need to do is to create a narrative about the kind of organizing the economy democratically, right? We can have the economy we choose, and if we choose to organize the economy so that people in fact have unemployment insurance that makes sense, or basic income, or other kinds of structural supports, Medicare for all is going to be part of that, right? We can have that kind of economy, and we have to figure out, and there's a lot of people working in this landscape to talk about exactly how we can have that. We should democratize the economy, and we should also think about how to put care at the center. One of the things that gets marginalized in conversations about markets is all of the unpaid work that so many of us doing in a different way now. So recentering care, for example, is a really important part of, I think, pushing back against a narrative that kind of assumes that so much reproductive work just happens off camera. Well, it's actually is off camera for me. I don't know about you guys, but it's all happening off camera and not compensated and not accounted for and not paid well for the people who get paid to do it and all the rest of it. So there's a big piece about that, those shifting narratives. And I guess maybe Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of Job Corps idea that we've talked about and how that connects to this?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. Before this all broke out, we heard certain political candidates talking about bold structural reforms, and then sort of passing into a phase where we were going to get a consensus candidate and sort of really more of the same. And it's pretty clear now that more of the same has got us where we are. And I think what Amy and I tried to do in the final Boston Review piece is think about a new politics of care. And it really is the basis for a redefinition of how we think about how we treat each other as a society. And we talked about a community health corps modeled on the Works Progress Administration from the New Deal era, but it's really, there's been lots of discussions about testing, contact tracing, and isolation. But what Amy and I try to get across in the article is that that's a pretty deficient notion of what needs to be done to lift communities up through this pandemic, and that even contact tracers that are working now are picking up the phones and talking to people who have far greater issues to deal with that will keep them from being able to successfully self-isolate, whether it's questions about eviction or getting access to food, or everybody in the family being unemployed or an abusive relationship in the household. And that if we're going to build a community health corps, we're going to deal with something beyond the sort of epidemic control strategy that sort of would be the sort of technocratic way to think through these problems in public health. And it's to think about how do we address the sort of, again, centuries old disparities in healthcare, which are being played out in zip codes and census tracts across the country that are not just about COVID. They're about HIV or diabetes or breast cancer or a whole host of other police violence. How do we deal with these issues in a structural way? And we think it's by building a community health corps from the ground up that's not, necessarily people who are trained in public health schools or medical schools or law schools, but are people who know their communities well and know what they need. And for fundamental pieces of sort of the public health work that needs to be done, it's built on trust and caring and community. And some of the other basic skills can be taught very quickly, particularly around contact tracing and epidemic control, but also, referrals to other services. And I think the heartening thing is that bills by some of the members of Congress are starting to sort of take on some of these expanded sort of community caring tasks as part of their proposals. It's also been interesting to see that the way unions and other sort of big political actors in our country are thinking about moving beyond the status quo. In a moment that seems, everything seemed tenable enough to people, Republicans and Democrats alike, in terms of certain aspects of healthcare and social services for the past 20 to 30 years, but now it all seems pretty broken. And I think we have an opportunity here to sort of get out of this this pandemic with a path to better health for all that many have been calling for for many decades now. And I think the only way to do that is to harken back to what Amy was saying at the beginning of this conversation, is to reorient our vision about how we think about the law, the economy, politics, and public health. And I think that's what the Boston Review pieces sort of try to do, is chart the sort of origins of our crisis in our past and then plot a path to the future towards something that's more oriented towards a new politics of care.
I mean, I think just to add one more piece about that, I was going to say that, you know, I think part of the idea with the Community Health Corps is it's a jobs program, and it should become a way of thinking about, you know, moving towards, you know, creating jobs that people are going to need, because this crisis is going to go on. And, you know, if we can embed these kinds of jobs, not just for the crisis, but beyond, you know, that starts to become a way to address, you know, the carnage that's going on in communities of color right now, which was happening from other things before COVID, and is happening in other ways in rural areas that also lack the health services that they need, right? And so it's a way to do that, but also planting a seed that I think, you know, again, thinking more broadly about our politics, you know, thinking maybe people are entitled to a job, and a good job that pays good wages and it's flexible, so that because we know they have care obligations and so forth. So I mean, I think part of what we're trying to do is also to connect to some broader thinking about reorganizing our political economy towards more social entitlements, and towards kind of power building that we need to do, for example, by organizing workers and creating jobs that have organizing protections in them. You know, we probably don't have time to discuss it here, but I think there's a lot of other structural things that we should be thinking about too, like reorganizing how R&D works for pharmaceuticals and access to medicines. And there's pieces of that agenda which are connected in various ways, although Greg and I didn't write about them so much, to this broader idea about reshaping our economy in ways that kind of serve us rather than exploit us.
That's a complex but inspiring note to end on. I think that I want to just mention that we will be linking to your Boston Review pieces on our website, so if folks want to learn more. I want to thank you both for being here. So we'll see you next time. Stay safe and be well.
Thanks.